Your local police can repel an attack. Anybody involved in lethal force, the legal doctrine in our country, and has been historically, has always been that the government can repel lethal attacks. The problem is that the drone strike program is often not about combatants. It is about people who may or may not be conspiring, but they're not in combat. They're in a car, they're in their house, they're in a restaurant, they're in a cafe. If we're going to bring that standard to America, what I'm doing down here today is asking the president to be explicit. If you're going to have the standard that you're going to kill non-combatants in America, come forward and please say it clearly so we know what we're up against. If you're not going to do it, come up with the easy answer is, I'm not going to kill non-combatants. That would have been easy for him to say. And he could have said, well, the military at some point in time, has to repel invasions. We know that, Mr. President. We're not questioning that. But we are questioning a drone strike program that, we don't know because nobody will tell us the numbers. The numbers are secret. One senator said in a public meeting the other day, 4,700 people have been killed overseas. If I had to venture a guess, a significant amount of them weren't involved in shooting at American soldiers. But if they were, by all means, kill them. If we're fighting a war in Afghanistan, which we have been, and if there are soldiers around the bend that are a threat to our soldiers, there is no due process at that point. But that's not what we're arguing about. We're arguing about targeted strikes of people not involved in combat. That's my concern. My concern also is that who is and what is a terrorist? Who is associated with terrorism? Because the government's put out many documents now that tell you to see something, say something. But the stuff you see, I'm not so sure that these people are terrorists. If you see somebody paying in cash, or if you have a store, one of your customers comes in frequently and they pay in cash, should you report them to the government? I can't imagine that that's the kind of standard that we're going to have in our country for deciding drone strikes. When it comes to some of these people, though, I think some of the drone strikes have probably been justified. Al Walkie, I think, was a traitor. This is not from looking at classified documents. This is just from reading the lay press. By all means, he gave up on his country, renounced his citizenship, went overseas, consorted, and aided the enemy. But one of the interesting questions about aiding the enemy is what exactly that means and what are the standards to be. Kevin Williamson writes for the National Review, and he wrote an article on drones that I think really brings this home. If you're going to talk about and want to know who are the people who could potentially be killed. Because in some ways, Al Walkie was a sympathizer, someone who aided and abetted by internet talk and chatter. That was the main thing he was accused of, actually. After the fact, they said he had more direct association. I don't know if that's true or not and haven't seen the secret information on that. But what I would say is that he was initially brought up as a sympathizer. And here's the problem. Many writers have said if you take up arms against your country, you're an enemy combatant. Well, I think that's true. If you're in Afghanistan, you got a grenade launcher on your shoulder and you're shooting at Americans, you are an enemy combatant. You don't get due process. But here's the question. If you're in Poughkeepsie and you're on the internet and you say, I sympathize with, some group around the world that doesn't like America, and you say bad things about America, are you a traitor? I mean, you can try someone for treason for that. I'm not sure if it'll rise up to that if you're politically opposed to what your government is doing and in favor of another. But Kevin Williamson gets it pretty clearly. He says, if sympathizing with our enemies and propagandizing on their behalf is equivalent to making war on our country, then the Johnson and Nixon administrations should have bombed every elite college in America. Because during the 1960s, that's all that came out was anti-America, anti-war. Is objecting to your government or objecting to the policy of your government sympathizing with the enemy. Some openly were sympathetic. No one will ever forget Jane Fonda swiveling around in North Vietnamese armored guns, and it was despicable. Now, it's one thing if you want to try her for treason, but are you going to just drop a drone Hellfire missile on Jane Fonda? Are you going to drop a Hellfire missile on those at Kent State? You know, our country objected to what happened at Kent State, which was, you know, in some ways not, it was not good, but in some ways accidental, since they were shooting over the heads of these people. But can you imagine, we've gone from a country who was rightfully upset about the deaths at Kent State to a country that now is going to say that if you're at your college and you're rabble-rousing because you don't like the government's foreign policy or the government's war actions, that you are sympathizing. See, there are a lot of questions that aren't being asked because sympathizing appears to be used as a standard for the drone strike program. We actually had students apparently during the Vietnam War who were actually raising funds for the Viet Cong. That to me does sound like treason. Sounds like something that you, when we're fighting an enemy and you're raising and giving comfort to the enemy, that does sound like treason. So I have no problems with some people actually being tried for treason, but they would get their day in court. They don't get a Hellfire missile sent to their house. There is, though, a difference between sympathizing and taking up arms. Most people around here who want to justify no rules, America's a battlefield, no limits to war, they really want to blur it all together. Because it's easier to say, oh, you don't want to stop anybody who's shooting at Americans. But it's not true. I think lethal force can be used against those engaged in lethal force. What troubles me about the drone strike program is that quite a few, I don't know the number, the Wall Street Journal says the bulk of the attacks in Pakistan have been signature attacks, meaning nobody named and nobody specifically identified, and that civilians aren't really counted because any male between the age of 16 and 50 is a combatant unless otherwise proven. But if those are the standards, I think we need to be alarmed. And I think there is a difference between sympathizing and taking up arms. One of the interesting things, and Kevin Williamson in the National Review brings this out, and it's sort of a conundrum for conservatives. Because the thing about saying someone was involved and just taking the government's word, like saying Al Walkie was involved with these other people and taking the government's word, because we have no way of ascertaining or getting and questioning whether secret information is true or not true, is that just a few years before this, a lot of people don't remember this, Al Walkie, who was killed, a couple years before this, Al Walkie was brought to the Pentagon to speak as part of a group of moderate Islamic preachers. They thought him to be an Islamic voice of reason. He even came to the Capitol and said prayers in the Capitol. This is the guy who the government said was a good guy for a while, who later said was a bad guy. Now, I think ultimately the evidence that he was a bad guy is pretty strong. But most of his crime was sympathizing. And was it enough of a standard? I think in a court, in a treasonous court, I think Al Walkie would have been convicted of treason were I a juror. I would have voted that he was committing treason, and I wouldn't have had trouble at all with a drone strike on him. But if we're going to take by extension the standard we used in putting him on the list, that he was a sympathizer, an agitator, and a pain in the royal you-know-what on the internet, there's a lot of those people in America. If that's going to be our standard. That's why I would feel a little more comforted if it weren't an accusation by a politician that unleashes Hellfire missiles. I would be a little more comforted, and I think we would all sleep a little better in our house at night if we knew that before the Hellfire missile comes down, a policeman would come to your door and say, we accuse you of this. And they might put handcuffs on you and take you to jail, but they don't get to summarily execute you. That's all I'm asking here. I'm asking for the president to admit publicly that he's not in favor of summary executions. That's really all I'm asking. Summary executions of non-combatants. It seems like a pretty easy answer. We could be done with this in a moment's notice. If someone will call the president, ask him the question, we could be done with this. Because that's what I want to hear. Not that he's not going to use the military to repel an invasion. Nobody's questioning the authority of the president to repel an invasion. But I am questioning the authority of the president to kill non-combatants, asleep at home, eating in the restaurant, or what have you. One of the things that Williamson brings up in this National Review article again, which I also found a little bit, it's a little bit off the subject, but somewhat related. You know, we are fearful, and we didn't do a very good job with 9/11, frankly. 9/11 occurred because of a lot of mistakes, and sometimes you can look back as a Monday morning quarterback and say, oh, we should have done this. But one of the things that always sort of bothered me about 9/11 was that no one was ever fired. In fact, they gave medals. The head of the FBI, the head of the CIA, everybody gets a medal. No one was ever fired. Now, some of you may not have remembered this, but there was a 20th hijacker. His name was Moussaoui. He was up in Minnesota, I believe. They capture him a month in advance to 9/11. And when they capture him, the FBI agent there, who was spot on and doing an excellent job, and really the guy who should have gotten the medal, was the FBI agent that caught Moussaoui and was asking his superiors to get a warrant. He asked repeatedly. He sends 70 letters to headquarters saying, can I have a warrant to open this guy's computer, to investigate him? He's turned down. He gets no response. It was a horrible and tragic human error. What do? We promote and give medals to the people who were in charge. That agent should have gotten a medal. But anybody above him who made the decision not to even ask for a warrant shouldn't have gone anywhere within the department. Williamson makes the point, he says, if our law enforcement and intelligence agencies, particularly the State Department, had been doing a minimally competent job vis-a-vis visa overstays and application screening, at least 15 of the 19 9/11 hijackers would have been caught. They were all here on student visas. They were all overstaying their student visas. Nobody was paying attention. I still ask that question to today. I ask, do we know where all the students are? Particularly from about 10 Middle Eastern countries. The ones that are in our country, do we know where they are? I think we have not a good enough system to know where they all are, whether they've come and gone. And this is a real problem. Had we actually looked at Moussaoui's computer, they did. They looked at it on September 12th, the day after 9/11. They looked at his computer. I think it, within hours, led them and linked them up to several of the hijackers in Florida and ultimately would have perhaps exposed the whole ring. Same thing was going on in Arizona at the same time. They had somebody in Arizona saying there's guys wanting to fly planes that don't want to learn how to land them. There were horrible and tragic occurrences that happened, human breakdown. But how do we fix it? We fix it the same way we fix everything in Washington. We threw a ton of money at it, and I mean a ton of money at it. Billions upon billions into the trillions of dollars have now been spent. But really, the main problem with 9/11 was lack of communication, lack of lack of really doing a good job at what you were already supposed to be doing. When we look at this issue, and as we go forward from here, I think what is most important to me is that we just not let this go. This is the first time that I've decided to come to the floor and speak in a true filibuster. People talk about the filibuster all the time. They say, the filibuster is overused and it's abused. A lot of times the filibuster in our country and in the Senate is actually requesting that 60 votes happen and we have to do everything by unanimous consent. So it almost never happens. I've been here 2 years and I don't think I've seen anybody come to the floor and speak in an open and spoken filibuster as I'm doing today. I think it's important, though, and I think that the issue rises to such an occasion because I think there are very few things, there are a lot of things we disagree on, Republicans and Democrats, and I think there are a lot of things we could actually pass up here, a lot of things that we actually agree to that we could actually pass if we'd get together and try to do smaller bills and work on what we agree and get away from some of the empty partisanship. But the reason I came to the floor today to do this is because I think certain things rise above party politics. Certain things rise above partisanship. And I think your right to be secure in your person, the right to be secure in your liberty, the right to be tried by a jury of your peers, these are things that are so important and rise to such a level that we shouldn't give up on them easily. And I don't see this battle as a partisan battle at all. I don't see this as Republicans versus Democrats. I would be here if there were a Republican president doing this. And really, the great irony of this is that President Obama's position on this is an extension of George Bush's opinion. It basically is a continuation and an expansion of George Bush's opinion. George Bush was a president who believed in a very expansive power. Virtually, some would say unlimited. He was accused of running an imperial presidency. The irony is that this president that we have currently was elected in opposition to that. This president was one elected who, when he was in this body, was often very vocal at saying that the president's powers were limited. When I first came here, one of the first votes that I was able to get was a vote on whether or not we should go to war without congressional approval. And so the interesting thing is that the war was beginning in Libya. It turned out to be a small war, but small wars sometimes lead to big wars. In fact, that was one of Eisenhower's admonitions, is beware of small wars, that you may find yourself in a big war. Fortunately, the Libya war didn't turn out to be a big war, although I think it's still a huge mess over there. And I think it's still yet to be determined whether Libya will descend into the chaos of radical Islam. I think there's a chance they still may descend into that chaos. But when the question came up about going to war in Libya, there was the question of, well, doesn't the Constitution say that you have to declare war? And so we looked back through some of the president's writings as a candidate. One of the president's writings I found very instructive, and I was quite proud of him for having said it. The president said that no president shall unilaterally go to war without the authority of Congress, unless there's an imminent threat to the country. I guess we should be a little wary of his unless now, since we know imminent doesn't have to be immediate, and imminent really no longer means what humans once thought imminent meant. But he did say that the president doesn't go to war by himself. I think it would be fair to say that candidate Obama also felt that the president didn't have the authority to imprison you indefinitely without a trial. I think it's also safe to say that Barack Obama of 2007 would be right down here with me arguing against this drone strike program if he were in the Senate. It amazes and disappoints me how much he's actually changed from what he once stood for. But I forced a vote on his words. I took his exact words. We quoted them and put them up on a standard next to me, and we voted on a sense of the Senate that said, no president should go to war without the authority of Congress, which basically just restates the Constitution. You would think that would be a pretty easy vote for people. I think I got less than 20 votes. That is the sad state of affairs we're in. Now, some who actually probably believe that refused to vote for it because they said, well, he's a Republican and I won't vote with a Republican. But I honestly tell you, were the shoe on the other foot, were there a Republican president here and I a Republican senator, I'd have exactly the same opinion. My opinion today on drone strikes would be exactly the same opinion under George Bush, and I was critical of George Bush as well. So were there a Republican president now, I would have the same instinct and the same resolution to carry this forward. And on the issue of war, it's the same no matter which president. One of the complaints that you hear a lot of times in the media is about there's no bipartisanship in Congress. Well, the interesting thing is actually there's a lot of bipartisanship in Congress. If you look at people who don't really believe in much restraint of government as far as civil liberties. It really is on both sides. And so you'll find that often these votes on whether or not the Constitution says that we have to declare war in the Congress, Republicans and Democrats vote overwhelmingly against that. And you need to realize the implications of that. What they're voting for is to say, we don't retain that power and we don't want it. The Constitution gave it to us, but we're giving it back. And this has been going on for a long time. Really, probably for over 100 years, starting with sort of the Woodrow Wilson sort of grab for presidential power. Presidents have been getting more and more powerful for over 100 years, Republican and Democrat. There was at one point in time in our history a pride among the Senate and a pride among the Congress that said, these are our powers and we're not giving them up. There were people on both sides of the aisle who would stand firm and say, this is not a power I'm willing to relinquish. This is not something that is good for the country. And by relinquishing the power of Congress, we relinquish something very fundamental to our republic, which is the checks and balances. That we should have checks and balances to help and try to prevent one body or one part of the three parts of government from obtaining too much power. And so there was a time when we tried to keep that power. Unfortunately, the bipartisanship that we have now, which many in the media fail to understand, they see us not getting along on taxes and on spending, but they fail to understand that on something very important, on whether or not an individual has a right to a trial by jury, whether an individual has the right to not be detained indefinitely, that there is quite a bit of bipartisanship, usually in the wrong direction. Now, I will say that there is some evolution and some trend towards people being more respectful of this. And there has been some work on both sides of the aisle that has brought some of us who believe in civil liberties together. There was a bill last year called the National Defense Authorization Bill. And in that bill, they said that there was a clause that says that Americans can be indefinitely detained. What does that mean? Well, it means forever, basically, or without a trial, no sort of sentence, no sort of adjudication of guilt or innocence, but an American citizen can be held. And so the question I had, and there was another Republican senator on the floor, I said, boy, does that mean you could actually be sent, an American sent to Guantanamo Bay from here, who's accused of something but never gets a trial? And his answer was yes. His answer was yes, you could send it if they're a danger to the country. The problem with that kind of thinking is that who gets to determine whether you're a danger? Who gets to determine whether you're guilty or innocent? It sort of begs the question of what our court system is set up to do is to try to find guilt or innocence. Guilt or innocence isn't always apparent. And sometimes an accusation is a false accusation. Sometimes accusations are made because people politically don't like your point of view. So the question becomes, should we have a process where we try to determine innocence or guilt? So in the National Defense Authorization Bill, there was an amendment that said that you can be indefinitely detained, an American could be sent to Guantanamo Bay. And we had a big fight over it, and we lost the first time around in 2012. We had an amendment that would have tried to protect American citizens. This was a good example of bipartisanship on our side. We had 45 votes, and I'd say it was probably about 38 Democrats and about 7 Republicans. And so there was an example of both sides kind of working together. We fought and we lost. The next year we came back and we fought for the same amendment again, and we beat them. Interestingly, we beat them. We had 67 votes to say that you cannot detain an American can't be sent to Guantanamo Bay without a trial, without an accusation, without a jury, without the Bill of Rights. You can't do that to Americans. We won the battle with 67 votes. The bill passes. The House passes their version without our amendment on it. It goes to conference committee where they work out the differences, and they stripped out our language. So sometimes when you win around here, you lose. But with the 67, there was a pretty good mix. Maybe 35, 40 Democrats and 15, 20 Republicans. So there is some emerging consensus or some kind of emerging group. One of the other senators has called it the checks and balances caucus, and I think that's a very accurate term, because that's part of what we're arguing for here. We're arguing that no one person should get too much power, or no one body would get too much power. Some people see all that fighting and disputing between the different branches of government. They see it in a bad light. They say, oh, with all that fighting and bickering, that's gridlock. But in some ways, our founding fathers, I think, weren't too opposed to a little bit of gridlock, particularly if it were gridlock that said, you know what, we're not going to make it easy to get rid of the First Amendment. It's not easy to get a constitutional amendment in our country. We've added some through the years, but it's not easy to do. We make it hard to amend the Constitution. And in fact, we make it such that it really isn't, we're not really a country that's majority rule. And I'm sort of a stickler for talking about the differences between a democracy and a republic. I think some people are sloppy with their words, and they love the idea that America is a democracy. You know, Woodrow Wilson said that we were going to war in the First World War to make the world safe for democracy. Well, number one, we're not a democracy, and we never were intended to be a democracy. When Franklin comes out of the Constitutional Convention, a woman comes up to him and asks him, what will it be? Will it be a monarchy or a democracy? And he says it's a republic. It's a constitutional republic if you can keep it. He was already worried, will democratic action lead to people straying away and giving a government too many powers? But we are a republic. And it's important to know how a difference is between a republic and a democracy, particularly with our history in our country. In our country, we had a period of time where majorities passed some very egregious and unfair and unjust laws. These were called the Jim Crow laws. They passed laws based on your race or the color of your skin, and these were passed by majorities. The important thing about the Constitution and about rights, and one of the reasons I'm here today talking about the Fifth Amendment and how it gives you the right not to be committed to prison or not to be killed without due process, is that our founders thought it was very important. This whole concept between a republic and a democracy, also between or considering the idea that majority state legislatures were voting on something, Jim Crow laws, that would say to a white person you can't sell a house to a black person or vice versa. Those laws were passed by majority rule. So anytime someone comes up to me and says you want a democracy, that's my first question. You're okay with Jim Crow then? Because democracies did bad things. But if you believe that rights are protected and that rights should be protected and that these individual rights are not something that a democracy can overturn, then you do truly believe in a protection that is more important than any democratic rule. There's been some dispute over this. There's a Supreme Court case by the name of Lochner back in 1905. The president doesn't like Lochner at all. He's very much opposed to it. But the one thing about Lochner that I like is that Lochner really expands the 14th Amendment. You know, the 13th, 14th, and 15th were passed after the Civil War, and usually over Democrat objection. In my state, the Democrats ruled the state legislature in Kentucky for many, many years, and they voted against the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. The great champions of emancipation, of voting rights, of all of the post-war amendments were the Republicans. Every African American in the country was a Republican before 1930. Virtually every African American. In 1931 in Louisville, there were 25,730 black Republicans. There were 129 black Democrats. Every African American was a Republican at one point in time. I try to tell people, even though the numbers have unfortunately reversed, that we are the party that believes in the immutability of rights. We don't believe that the democracy can take away your rights, that a majority rule can take away your First Amendment, your Second Amendment, your Fourth Amendment. And I think if we got that message out, we might change some of what goes on. But the president is an opponent of the Lochner decision. And in the Lochner decision, a state legislature decides something. And it's not really of importance what the decision is so much as that it's about judicial deference, about whether the court should say, well, the state legislature decided this and majorities should get to rule. So many, like Oliver Wendell Holmes, was a dissent in the Lochner case, and he basically said majorities should get to rule. Herbert Crowley, who was one of the founders of the New Republic, he wrote that we can get trapped up in all this support for the Bill of Rights and all these ancient individual rights. If we get too carried away with that, this whole idea of rights thing, we'll have a monarchy of the law instead of a monarchy of the people. Well, it was for good reason that we established a republic and not a democracy. One of the best contrasts, I think, and it may not be a perfect contrast, but I think it has some truth to it and some validity, is that our revolution worked. But our revolution, we established a constrained government. In France, the mob came into power. They had mob rule. The French Revolution was a disaster. And we had some things going for us. You know, we had a colonial government with English common law and English adjudication, and we'd adopted English practices. We were Englishmen, and we believed in the rights of Englishmen. We had that for several hundred years in our country, so it was easier for us to have a revolution, and they didn't quite have that going on in France, and so it was different. But one of the differences I see between the American and the French is we established a republic. And we weren't going to have any majority rule where the majority were, setting up a guillotine. Now, ours wasn't perfect, obviously. The founders left and allowed slavery to still occur. Interestingly, though, if you read the Constitution, I think they were embarrassed by it. The word slave doesn't occur in our Constitution. And in fact, there were many writers, many abolitionist writers. There was a writer by the name of Lysander Spooner, who was an abolitionist, and he actually wrote about the unconstitutionality of slavery before the war. And really, if you read the Constitution and you leave out or acknowledge that there is no word in there slavery and nothing that really says you have to be consigned to slavery, there are things in there that say you can't be kept without being presented with charges. Habeas corpus means present the body. In the old days in England and in different monarchies, they'd just snatch you up. If you were next in line to be king or they made you mad, they snatched you up and put you in the tower. And so they came up with the right of habeas corpus. You had to present the body. You had to say, he's been arrested, and these are the charges against him. We kind of have gotten, to where there's some concern in our country about that, but we had that right all along. So Lysander Spooner wrote and said, well, why shouldn't a slave come forward and say, this guy's keeping me, he's telling me that I have to work for him, but I haven't been charged with anything. What is my crime? Eventually, one court case did come forward, and it was ruled incorrectly. And I'm not sure exactly how the arguments were, but in Dred Scott, they rule you can't make the argument. But I don't know if habeas corpus was part of that case or not, but it should have been. What I'm trying to say, though, is that the rights of the Constitution, the rights of the individual that were enshrined in the Constitution, are important things that democracies can't overturn. So when you get to the Lochner case is in 1905. The majority rules 5-4 that the right to make a contract is part of your due process. Someone can't deprive you of determining how long your working hours are without due process. So President Obama is a big opponent to this, but I would ask him, among the other things I'm asking him today, to rethink the Lochner case. Because the Lochner case really is what precedes and what the case Buchanan v. Worley is predicated upon. In Buchanan v. Worley is a case in 1917. Interestingly, it comes from my state, from Louisville, Kentucky. There's a young African-American attorney by the name of William Worley. He's a Republican, like most African-Americans were in Louisville in those days. He was a founder of the NAACP. And like most founders of the NAACP, a Republican. And so what they do in 1914 is they sue because the Kentucky legislature, by majority rule, by Democratic action, passes a law saying a white person can't sell to a black person in a white section of town or vice versa. So this is the first case the NAACP brings up. Moorfield Story was the famous, I think he was the first president of NAACP, famous attorney. Him and an attorney by the name of, I think it's Clinton Blanky. But they go forward with this case, and they win the case. It actually passes overwhelmingly, but interestingly, this case to end Jim Crow is based on the Lochner decision. So those who don't like the Lochner decision, I'd say go back. We need to reassess Lochner. In fact, there's a good book by Bernstein from George Mason talking about rehabilitating Lochner. The thing is that with majority rule, if you say we're going to give deference to majority rule, or we're going to have judicial restraint, and we're going to say, well, whatever the majority wants is fine, you set yourself up for a diminishment of rights. I go back to the discussion of the Constitution limits power that is given to Congress, but it doesn't limit rights. The powers are enumerated, your rights are unenumerated. The powers given to the government are few and defined. The freedoms left to you are many and undefined. And that's important. And what does this have to do with Lochner? The case in Lochner is whether a majority rule, a state legislature, can take away your due process to contract. Can they take away your life and liberty without due process? And the court rules no. I think it's a wonderful decision. It expands the 14th Amendment and says to the people that you have unenumerated rights. Now, there's some dissension on how we look at these cases, but when you go forward to Buchanan v. Worley, the case about Jim Crow laws and housing segregation, one of the people who was going to dissent, and I think he thought better of it when he thought about he would be the first justice in probably 70 some odd years to say that he believed in the Jim Crow laws and was upholding Jim Crow laws, was Oliver Wendell Holmes. He actually writes an opinion that has been found but was never presented to the court, and he ended up voting to get rid of the Jim Crow laws. But the interesting thing is he actually wrote an opinion in favor because he believed so strongly in majority rule. I don't think these questions, some may think these are idle questions. I don't think it's an idle question whether or not you have a democracy or a republic. I think that these questions from Lochner, from Buchanan v. Worley, all the way through to the present are important. Last year, or in the last couple of years, we had two cases on gun rights, the Second Amendment. These are called Heller and McDonald. Both of them, I think, can be seen as, once again, an expansion of the 14th Amendment to say your privileges and immunities, which are part of the 14th Amendment, include the Second Amendment, and they include certain rights. In fact, I think any power or any right not given up to the government or limited by the enumerated powers is yours. So when they say the privileges and immunities of the 14th Amendment, I believe that means everything else. What does that mean? It means I believe in a very circumscribed view for government. Now, one of the side benefits of having a circumscribed view of the government would be a government that's not allowed to do much wouldn't get in many problems. For example, if your government wasn't allowed to spend money that it didn't have, or if your government wasn't allowed to spend money on programs that were not enumerated as being within the purview of the federal government, you wouldn't have these massive deficits. We'd have never gotten in this fix if we believed in a republic and not a democracy. Now, what proof do I have that the current officials believe in democracy versus republic? When Obamacare came forward, you know, the comments from the then Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, were a majority passed this, you know. We passed this by a majority. It's a law. Why would anybody question the constitutionality? The president said the same thing. The president said, well, a majority passed this. What right has the court to overturn this? The question has been written about by many, I think, brilliant scholars who have looked at the Constitution and looked at what it means. Some of this has to do with whether or not you presume liberty. Randy Barnett's written about this, Restoring the Constitution, whether you have a presumption of liberty or whether you have a presumption of constitutionality. Now, that may sound a little esoteric. What does that mean? It's whether or not when they pass a law up here, you just presume it's fine because it's a law, and the judges should give deference to it because it was a law. Some of this is kind of confusing because you think, oh, I'm arguing for judicial activism. In a way, I kind of am, because if the Congress usurps the Constitution, if the Congress takes away from your rights, the judges should stop them in their tracks. I'm not arguing for deference to the legislature. I'm arguing for deference to the Constitution. And so I'm also arguing that there is a presumption of liberty. This goes back to the way we want to look at the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment says that we have unenumerated rights. It says that basically, or I guess by extension, when you go from the 14th Amendment to the 9th and 10th Amendment is the best way to look at this. The 14th Amendment talks about privileges and immunities. And then when you look at what the 9th and 10th Amendment do, they say, those powers not given to the government, those freedoms you didn't relinquish, or those powers you didn't give to the government are left to the states and the people respectively. And it says they're not to be disparaged. I've always loved the way that was worded, not to be disparaged. Not only is the federal government not to trample on your rights, they are not to be disparaged. But these rights are unlimited. They're yours. You got them from your Creator. These are natural-born rights, and no democracy should be able to take these away from you. Now, by changing the Constitution, they could literally take away your freedom of speech or your freedom to practice your religion. I don't think I see that ever happening. And it's difficult to change our Constitution, but incredibly important that your founding fathers put it in there and made it difficult. Now, I always kind of joke that if you go to a conservative meeting and you talk about the Second Amendment, everybody pats you on the back and they all love you until you get to the Fourth Amendment. But if we're going to have the Second Amendment, I think you got to have the Fourth Amendment. The right to be free in your person from unreasonable searches and seizures, that a judge should have to have a warrant to come in your house. I always say, well, how are your guns going to be protected if they can come in your house without a warrant? You got to have the Fourth Amendment. But you also have to have the Fifth Amendment. We don't talk about the Fifth Amendment very much. Everything's about the Second Amendment. It's been all over the news. You can't turn on a channel without talking about the Second Amendment. But I think today's as good a day as any to talk about the Fifth Amendment. I've come here to filibuster the nomination of John Brennan because I think the Fifth Amendment is important, that I think we shouldn't be cavalier. I don't think we should be casual in our disregard for the Constitution. I think that to allow the president to trample on and shred the Constitution and say that the Fifth Amendment no longer applies is a travesty, and it's something that we should not do lightly. So I think it's worth a discussion. So far it's sort of a one-way discussion, but we'll see. But it's worth a discussion that we talk about the Fifth Amendment. It says no person shall be deprived of their liberty, of their life or their liberty. That's what it means. It's pretty clear and it's pretty plain. You can't take away someone's life and liberty without due process or an indictment. So it should trouble every American. I can't imagine that there wouldn't be an American in our country that would not be troubled that we're talking about killing non-combatants in America with drone strikes. We have to get the president to respond to this. I don't think it's good enough for the president to say, I haven't done it yet. I don't intend to do it, but I might. His oath of office says he will preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. The oath of office doesn't say, well, I intend to when it's convenient. I mean, I've never seen a president go out on the lawn with the Chief Justice and say, I intend to follow the Constitution when it's convenient. Because what he says is, he won't drop a Hellfire missile on you unless it's infeasible to capture you. That's what they're doing overseas. If that's going to be the standard for America, if you're not going to get a Hellfire missile on you unless it's infeasible, to me that sounds like unless it's convenient. If it's inconvenient, non-feasible sounds like inconveniency is the standard. You know, I asked Secretary Kerry about this in his nominating process. I said, well, can you go to war without Congress approving of it, without a declaration of war like the Constitution says? And he said, no, I intend to obey the Constitution, except for when I don't intend to obey the Constitution, and when it's kind of, it's hard to get things through Congress, and Congress is so many squabbles and so many fights. So, yeah, most of the time we will come to Congress and we'll ask for a declaration of war, which, by the way, we have not done since World War I. And when we did, was voted on nearly unanimously. We have not had a declaration of war. But this is the standard we get to. They don't intend to kill anyone, and we don't intend to go to war without a declaration of war unless it's impractical to get your approval. Well, that was the point. If you don't get the point of the Constitution, if you don't get the point of what kind of system our government set up, what kind of system our founders set up, it was to make it impractical. It was to make it difficult to go to war. It was to make it difficult and make it important there would be debate and checks and balances. If inconveniency is our standard for going to war without Congress, inconveniency is our standard for killing Americans on American soil with drones, I mean, I think we've sunk to a new low. I just can't imagine as a country that that's the standard you want to have. And I want to reiterate, this doesn't have anything to do with the president being a Democrat. Whether he was a Democrat or Republican, I don't question his motives. I've met the president several times. I really don't think he would do this. But the thing is I'm troubled by the fact that he won't tell us he won't. I mean, if he is a good man, and we believe him to be a good man that would never kill non-combatants in a cafe in Houston, sitting out in a sidewalk cafe smoking that's right, you're not allowed to smoke cigarettes anymore, but let's say they're sitting in a cafe. If the president's not going to kill them, why wouldn't he just say he's not going to kill them there? That's the troubling aspect to this, is that if the president will not acknowledge that he's not going to kill non-combatants in America. The real problem also with this is we are now engaged in a limitless war. And a lot of Americans may not know this, but people all the time up here are saying it. You have to read between the lines sometimes to hear what they're saying. They're saying that there's no geographic limit to the war. That's what Brennan has said. What does that mean? I thought we went to war in Afghanistan. I really thought, even at the time, I wasn't here, but would have voted to go to war. I thought they were voting to go to war to get the people who attacked us on 9/11. I was all for it. I still am all for that. But we're now using that resolution to go to war to have no geographic limit for drone strikes anywhere in the whole world, but not only no geographic limit, no temporal limit, which means no timeline. There is no end to the war in Afghanistan. The war will never end. And if you have no geographic limit, many on my side say the battlefield's everywhere and the battlefield's in the United States. It's one thing to say that, but realize what they mean by that. They say because the battlefield is here, that the laws of war apply. That's what a drone strike is. A drone strike is not something you do domestically. They're saying the laws of war apply. Well, if you change the words around, what are the laws of war? Martial law. I think if you ask Americans, are you in favor of martial law by the president? I don't think many would be. But many in this body would gladly give up their power, would gladly say America's now the battlefield, and so the laws of war should operate. The laws of war are that there really is no due process in war. I'm not arguing for due process in war. I think it's frankly impossible. If you have gone as an American to Afghanistan and you're fighting against us, you don't get due process. You don't get your Miranda rights. It's an impossibility to have the Constitution operating in a battlefield. So I'm not for that, but I am against defining the battlefield as being everywhere, including my house, my office, including everywhere in America. If it's a battlefield, you have no rights. The war zone is a zone where you do not get due process. You do not get Miranda rights. You do not get an attorney. But it should be different in our country. If our country is a battlefield, if our country is a war zone, what's left? I thought we were fighting to preserve our way. I thought we were fighting to preserve and protect our Constitution. What are we fighting for if we're not going to protect our rights at home? The Bill of Rights is too important to scrap it. The Bill of Rights is too important to let any president, Republican or Democrat, simply come forward and say, well, I haven't broken the Constitution yet, and I don't intend to break the Constitution, but I might, because they're everywhere. And the battlefield's everywhere, and we're so frightened that we must do anything. I think it's good to be angry, upset, and really to even to want vengeance sometimes against people who attack you. I was all for, punishing those who attacked us after 9/11. But I think also at the same time, we need to not let that get in the way of, what is our way of life and what are we protecting here. When we look at this and we look at what's going on with terrorism, we need to keep in perspective that these people can do us harm, but they're incredibly weak people. They're incredibly cowardly in a way. They have no armies. They have the ability to inflict terrorism, which is what weak people do. People who have no armies and no strength attack civilians. It's a weak and cowardly way to attack your enemies. But it's not something that we should cower so much that we say, well, gosh, someday they may come and blow the Senate up, which would be terrible. I mean, I think the things that terrorists do are terrible, but I'm not saying that because we're so frightened of them coming that we say, well, why don't we just have camps again? Why don't we just round up? The Japanese Americans were a threat in the war. We just rounded them up, and we didn't have, guess what? No Japanese Americans attacked us, so it must have worked. I think it was an abomination what we did. It's one of the worst and most tragic episodes in our history, and the fact that our courts upheld it. But are we so frightened that we're going to give up on our Bill of Rights? Are we so frightened that the next thing we do is round up people who have a different color skin because we think, well, they've got cousins who live in Lebanon? So we can't give up on what really makes America special. What makes America special is the Bill of Rights. What makes us special is really that we're not a democracy. There are a lot of democracies around the world. We're a republic. We're a constitutional republic. We are a country that enshrined our rights, took care and deliberation, and wrote our rights down, and they're not supposed to be usurped by any majority. So it is important that we know that we're not a democracy. We're a constitutional republic. It's important for me to say and know that my rights came from my Creator. You don't have to agree with me on that. Some people think they came naturally to them, but they think that there's a natural state of being that is free. Now, we do give up some freedom. We give up some freedom to pay taxes. If I work, all of my labor is mine, and I give up some of my labor and some of my wages to a government. And to live in a civilized world, you do give up a little bit. But what I've always argued for is that we should minimize what freedom we give up. That's why you should always minimize taxes. You should minimize the size of your government, because everything you give up in taxes or everything you give up to your government is loss of your sweat equity, your labor. It's yours. It's nobody else's. So you give up a very minimum of it. Now, there's another argument. That's sort of the freedom argument for why we should keep government minimized. The other argument for why we should keep government minimized is more of an efficiency argument. And this comes from Milton Friedman, but I think he put it very succinctly. He said that nobody spends someone else's money as wisely or as frugally as you spend your own. It's a simple statement, but I think in one statement, one sentence, one simple sentence sort of, brings forward something about government that's very true. People up here just don't spend it wisely. The reason they don't spend it wisely is it's not theirs, and they have no incentive. In fact, they have a perverse and wrong-headed incentive that says, I need to spend all of my money or I won't get it the next year. So government agencies incredibly want to spend all the money and more to make sure there's nothing left at the end of the year. Now, if you listen to some people, they would say, oh, no, government is just here to help people. Without government and without this massive, huge government that we have to have the debt because we need all the things we get from government. Will Rogers once wrote and said, be lucky you don't get all the government you're paying for. Now, George Will recently wrote, and he sort of put a twist on that, and he said that used to be true, but now I think you're getting more government than you pay for. That sort of is the truth now. We get a ton of government. Our taxes cover about 60-70% of what we spend up here. What kind of country gets rich borrowing 30 cents on every dollar? You know, what kind of country or what kind of family can spend 30% more that comes in? Some things are pretty simple. Wealth accumulation for you or wealth accumulation for a country is by savings. You don't get wealthy by spending more money than comes in. And so as we look to these things, I think we need to be cognizant of the reasons why we would want to have smaller, not bigger government. But we would have smaller government if we paid attention to the rules. The rules are very important. And when people talk about, oh, well, that would be a monarchy of the law, or they say that would be too rigid to live under the laws. We need a living, breathing, evolving Constitution. I think things change over time. You get new technologies, you know, drone strikes and things are new technologies. But I think what doesn't change are certain freedoms that are going to be the same now as they will be in 10,000 years. I think the freedom for people to worship is something that I don't want majority rule to decide. And you say, well, what does the freedom to worship have to do with drone strikes? Well, it's hard to worship after Hellfire missiles, been launched on you. So the thing is that all of our rights, there's a panoply of rights. They're all interconnected, and they all come from sort of the basic right to life. If you don't have the right to be secure in your person, you don't have any other rights. So as we diminish one right, we attack at the foundation. But if we are at a foundation where we're saying that we can strike a person in America with no trial, with no accusation, I think we've come a long way from where we began. And I worry about it. I worry about it not just in the abstract sense, not just in the sense that, these are a right in abstract and that we lose something that you can't actually touch or feel. I worry really about it in the sense that I don't know that how you continue to exist as a country if you don't believe in some fundamental rights, some fundamental right and wrong. After Obamacare passed and there were some questions about its constitutionality, they asked a representative from the House side. He was asked, well, what about the constitutionality? And he said, why would I care? Most of the things we do up here have no constitutional justification. We've gotten to the point where people care more about having enough votes. They think it's right if you have a majority vote here, as opposed to that there are certain immutable rights and wrongs, that there are certain immutable rights that were there at the founding of our country that will be there in 100 years or 1,000 years from now. Your right to be secure in your person, the right that your government can't take away these privileges. This is not a new fight. Really, from the beginning of time, there's been a struggle with the people versus the leaders. The leaders always want more. The amazing thing is it's sort of like a contagion. Not many people get to be president in this country. One person gets to be. We've had, in the 40s, 44, 45 presidents. We haven't had many presidents. But there's something contagious about the office. It's that power corrupts, I think. Lord Acton said that it's not just that power corrupts, but that absolute power corrupts absolutely. I think people can become intoxicated with power. I don't know if that's the explanation for President Obama's about face. He was one who, at a time when he was in this body, believed in some restraint, believed in Senate authority, believed in, actually didn't even believe in raising the debt ceiling when he was here. The thing is what we would hope for is someday to have a president who believed, even after assuming office, that the powers of the office should be protected. I think we run the risk, as we allow more and more power to gravitate to the president, we run the risk of living under an imperial presidency. Now, I've said some inflammatory statements that, the president's acting like a king. Some of that is inflammatory.